There's a fascination about Egypt, a glamour, a romance. On my trips, people tell me they've been dreaming of traveling to Egypt since early childhood. There are other wonderful sacred places in the world, Gothic cathedrals, Mayan pyramids, Islamic mosques, Hindu and Buddhist temples. But there is nothing anywhere that matches the grandeur, power, and perfection of Egypt. Yet unless you see Egypt through symbolist eyes, you've not seen Egypt at all. One wonders how people come back from Egypt and live lives the way they lived them before, wrote Florence Nightingale back in 1850. The answer is, they don't. 2 weeks in Egypt and you will understand the difference, finally, between true civilization and progress. Just remember, if you don't see Egypt through symbolist eyes, you don't see Egypt at all.
So I looked out of the window, and there they were, the amazing pyramids. Next morning, bright and early, we got up and headed off, and there it was, the world's most famous statue. You really could get a sense and a feeling for the beauty and the absolute magnificence of these monuments that have fascinated people for so many thousands of years. But this trip was totally different from the typical tourist trip. Our host was John West. John won an Emmy for his documentary about the Sphinx a few years back. John's what you call connected. He was able to get us actually into and right next to the Sphinx, so we had a front row seat and could actually walk in, walk through it, and actually touch the Sphinx, which most tourists never get even close to. What a wonderful place to be. Notice a pause here. It's really made a big impression on me. But I was able to walk through and just see the whole thing, so this is what you're able to see, as if you were able to poke along and see something that has existed for, well, when we got into it, we could see, John pointed out, the weathering shows the Sphinx is much, much older than people suspect.
Look down this way. You see that this is the original line of the actual enclosure wall. You see that it's a straight line, right? It goes all the way down there. So you've got about 5.5 feet of sheer weathering that has weathered this wall back from its original line here. This is a big question. This doesn't happen overnight. There it is.
You can't dispute it, yeah.
And go explain the weathering.
Well, if you look at this, from the American Southwest, I know that this doesn't, for sandstone, this takes thousands and thousands of years, and particularly in a dry climate. Of course, Egypt is much more than the Sphinx. Right next door at the Sphinx Temple, we can see some of the other evidence of this early megalithic state. The idea that Egypt was actually a legacy from a prior civilization. Look here. They baffled the corners. Instead of having a right angle, they went through incredible extra effort by hand to carve out little corners around and edges in here. And the idea is, this is way beyond our sophistication and understanding today. The idea is this would actually contain the energy or whatever they were creating in that room. All this granite was quarried in Aswan, about 600 miles south. This is the famous unfinished obelisk. Get an idea of how they actually built these things. Look at the channel carved right out of solid rock. How they got underneath this, nobody knows. But just imagine, this is a 1,200-ton piece of stone that they're taking out completely by hand. I don't know if there's even a crane in the whole world that could lift this. So then we walked away from the Sphinx complex towards the pyramids, and as you can see, there's just treasures and things all over the place. The sheer scale and the size, and I don't know if it's the energy or what you want to call it, but there certainly is something about these incredible structures that have drawn so many people for so long. Again, the huge rocks and the stones for the precise fitting and putting all these things in by hand and carving them and carrying them. You wonder, why did they do this? When they found this boat buried in the sand next to the pyramids, it completely threw out the notion that these were some dumb, simple primitives who happened to build these buildings because they liked the sun. This is a sophisticated ocean-going vessel. That technology was not improved until just fairly recently. But not only that, it was loaded with symbolism that we saw all throughout Egypt. The next morning, bright and early, we traveled down the Nile. And in this area right next to it, there's a huge, massive complex called Saqqara, where there's all sorts of treasures. So we saw a lot of things. So John began to explain to us a lot of the symbolism and a lot of the meanings, and showed us some pretty cool things about this complex.
Things that we've seen in the noble tombs, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, an important lesson that the king is no different from anyone else.
This was really cool. It's a harmonically designed chamber. Even though it's in ruins now, it still works. And going into this little room over here, you can hear something really quite fascinating. I wouldn't have believed it unless I did it and saw it for myself. I don't know if the television will pick up the sound that you can hear. If you listen to this next bit with headphones, you can hear it. I could actually hear my heart beating. Listen. We went next over to the tombs, and I smuggled my camera in. You're not supposed to take pictures inside the tombs anymore. They're pretty strict about that. But I smuggled my camera, which is why the footage of all off. But this is something we'll see more of. This is the very old, called the Old Kingdom. It's a very more simple and powerfully designed that came from the very, very beginnings of ancient Egypt. It's really important to understand that everything in ancient Egypt was colorful. All these walls, all these buildings, particularly in the later stages of Egypt, they use color. They use all their senses. Touch, taste, smell. Everything was beautifully ornate. Look at the precision that they did, how they built things, the craftsmanship that went into it. All of the statues, the buildings, everything showed harmonious relations. I like this one. The balance between the male and the female and the child, the perfect harmony. Later that day in this vast desert, we had an experience that really made me feel like a real pharaoh. We were able to actually go inside one of the pyramids. We walked up about 10 flights of stairs and then down 10 flights of stairs, crouched in half, until we got to the very bottom, the very base, the inner core of the pyramid. And when we got there, oh yeah, it was worth it. Look at the beveling, look at the precision in the walls over here. But even more interesting, here at the very foundation, we see what looks as if the pyramid itself was perhaps built on a megalithic site that was thousands and thousands of years old beyond that time.
But what's interesting here, this is a place, it isn't, this is, and the look of this is quite megalithic.
So then we traveled south to Luxor. We flew there. It's about 500 miles from Cairo. This is our hotel, which is right on the Nile River. This is something the pharaohs watched for tens of thousands of years, perhaps. And then we moved on, and what a treat. We got at the temple just as the call to prayers. Now, that wasn't happening a couple thousand years ago, but it sort of gave it a really nice effect. This temple was phenomenal. My favorite place in all of Egypt. It was designed, it's believed, as the Temple of Man. It was very, very intelligently built and crafted in such a way that it related to the human body. I could go on about this for quite some time, and we went through it very thoroughly. One of the things that interested me was how the symbols and the language of Egypt all was based on religion, and they use plants, they use nature to express small symbols of what they thought were aspects of the Supreme.
You notice the headdress here. See, it's a vulture. It's so artfully done that you don't even notice that it's there. But in fact, it means the vulture is Mutlu Nechbet, can represent the cosmic femininity. And here it's not a headdress, it's that her whole consciousness is cosmic feminine symbolism there.
And there's a whole book in this. On your left is Horus. Horus is holding in his right hand the Ankh, which became the Christian cross. This symbol we can see the triangle means to give, so this means to give life. The woman here is giving the breath of life. The woman's dress is see-through, she's not hiding anything. Her both hands are right-handed, which usually means active. This may be familiar. Here is the serpent and what appears to be an apple tree. There's the cobra, which represents higher or spiritual wisdom. The bull represents reproductive energies. The crocodile represented death. The hippopotamus, birth. All the animals, if you look deeply at their nature, there's some aspect of that relates to one part of our human existence. Well, there's Sekhmet, which is a lioness on a woman's body representing the power of femininity, something the ladies really enjoyed. There's the ram and the ram's head. This is the jet column. The jet column was the backbone, strength and courage. This is Set. Set's an animal we don't know, but represents the what later became the devil, the dark side, if it were. The Egyptians did have a sense of humor. Here they show the power behind the throne. There were some strange creatures in this country. The next day we drove in a huge convoy with other tourists. We went to the temple of Abydos. Abydos is the temple of Osiris, which is rebirth. Here's where they found the names of all the kings. Kings' names were always circled. Back here, originally buried in the sand, they uncovered this. Now this, John believes, is megalithic, and you can tell by the look, it does look very megalithic. This may be part and linked to the same generation that built the Sphinx some 13,000 years ago. Then we went to the temple of Dendra. Dendra is one of my favorite places.
And this is for healing. This is definitely a healing temple. Over there, all the mud brick stuff, that was the sanatorium where they did dream interpretation.
Dendra is dedicated to Hathor, the cow, or nourishment. Here they found in the ceiling the actual zodiac. We spent quite a bit of time over here, and this is one of my favorite places simply because they celebrated New Year's Eve here. They had a big party.
Oh, here you see a typical floor or ceiling, and you see how it's all this weird, because it's not crazy paving, it's all very carefully fitted, but it's all, I mean, there are straight lines, but they're all, in other words, it's a baffle to contain the energy.
All this is part of a very remote complex, and you can get a sense that there could be just some amazing things hidden away. Next morning, bright and early, we went to the temple at Karnak. Karnak was built around the winter solstice. We were there a couple weeks early, but you could see the sun will go right as it rises. It goes right through the whole middle of the temple. We'll walk through this temple, and you can enjoy listening to John.
Karnak is the temple of material creation itself, of organic creation. And this is formal. I don't think even the Egyptologists would disagree with that. There are two very special aspects, many things, two particular that support the theory that this is designed for that purpose. One is that it's the only temple that we know of that from beginning to end is in a state of perpetual creation. Every single pharaoh, I think from the Middle Kingdom on, the oldest known area here is Middle Kingdom, which is just beyond the sanctuary there. So every single pharaoh from Middle Kingdom on has left a cartouche somewhere or a building somewhere in here. So it's in a state of perpetual creation, and it grows out from the center, not exactly in a spiral, but like the rings of an onion, and out and out, both east-west and north-south. And of course, much of it is totally ruinous, but some of it is off limits, and it's so huge you can't explore all of it. But everything is here right down to the Ptolemies. And so that's one indication. The other is here in the hypostyle hall, where, remember, this is where all hypostyle halls are where Horus is raised to manhood, like Jesus is instructed in the temple until he reaches maturity.
Then John showed us something that was truly amazing. Listen as we went over to an obelisk that was over on its side, and John is just tapping the end.
Someone showed me this when I first started coming here, one of the guides, and then I started putting two and two together and came up with what I think may well be the rationale for the obelisk in the first place. Move over this rope, put your ear to it.
Wow. Don't get so they will make us leave. Can you? It sounds like an omen. You must come. Can you? Can you?
Lucy Lamy had me find out what the measurements of all of the obelisks were, and they were always some exact fraction of the latitude of that particular temple. So in other words, they are quite literally attuned to the temple itself. Now we know, again, no geologist would disagree with this, and we saw at CPAC actually, a guy who was actually able to measure these things, that the whole Earth is a vibrating whole. There are magnetic and all kinds of energies in the Earth, and so if you have these things behave, and they're in pairs, quite literally as tuning forks. You can't hear the energies of the Earth, but you know that. I mean, you know that they're there scientifically, and you also know they're there experientially, because when you walk around, you go through the woods, or you go through a beautiful city, or something like that, you get a sense that this place is special.
Everywhere we went in Egypt, we experienced the simple fact that these weren't some dumb primitives who happened to get lucky by building these amazing temples, these incredibly precise buildings and complexes. They had mathematics, they had the Fibonacci numbers, they had pi, they had a level of communication supreme. They had the pyramids. Everything was built with an engineering mastery and precision that we cannot duplicate even today. They had an ability to diagnose and treat complex brain injuries. We know that they understood the solar system. Their calendar was much more advanced than even ours today. Every time you turned a corner, you could walk into a sound chamber or someplace and actually feel the vibrations, feel the natural energy. And maybe this civilization did have tremendous knowledge. Look, here it is in the Temple of Luxor, and in many places, the story of the Immaculate Conception. We know we can read it because we can decode it.
And what's happening here, this is the mother Mutnamoya, who is the mother of Amenhotep III. And here she is, and she's being, as you might say, sort of embraced by Amon, with double-plumed headdress. We'll see much more of that. It's Amon, you see the beard, which proves he shows he's a god. And they're sitting on a platform being supported over here. You see they're being supported by two goddesses, and they are sitting upon a bed here, or a bench, which itself represents the glyph for heaven, like for heaven, which looks exactly like that. So this whole thing is taking place in is taking place in the celestial realm. And the long passage here in hieroglyphs.
It's him asking Jehuti
to
find him the right one, the one, and he found him.
And this hieroglyph here, Amon is telling the Queen Mother that she is going to give birth to a divine child.
Over here in the Valley of the Kings, we were able to explore many of the great complexes and tombs and get a first-hand view. Here in this temple's wall, there is coconut trees and people living in homes on stilts. This is not in Egypt. They don't have coconut palms anywhere near Egypt. Going into the tombs was a special experience. We could see many of the purely preserved in its full color. The symbols, the messages, the simple but powerful, that's the sky we saw everywhere, the simple but powerful messages. And this is how they actually restored many of these temples. We had a first-hand view from some of the local craftsmen. Well, they glue it in. Everything here was a very, very painstaking process, and we have to be appreciative because hundreds of years ago, these temples were very ruinous, and thousands of people have painstakingly worked to preserve this treasure. So then if you take a train a couple hours south of Luxor down to Aswan, you can experience the full completion of ancient Egypt. This is the Temple of Philae. It's built on an island off the Nile. It was the last surviving true temple of ancient Egypt. I think it lasted to about the year 450 A.D. And one final point we can see about the change in history of ancient Egypt. You see, this temple here is very late period, and there's a change in the architecture and the writing, and it's very, very important.
One of the differences Ptolemaic from earlier work is that the columns, the capitals of the columns, are much more ornate. Because a very different feel to the whole temple.
Although the writings and pictures look the same to us, casual observers, there was a very, very definite change in the history. It started very powerful, very advanced, and actually somewhat degenerated as it became more ornate over time and became more sensual. This is where the civilization that lasted for, say, 10, 11,000 years, maybe much more, ended at this very location. Maybe it is possible that there was an advanced civilization living far, far in the ancient, distant past. And this civilization had tremendous knowledge, tremendous insight into nature, into human beings, into the environment of the Earth and the solar system we live in. And we know for certain that there have been tremendous calamities in the planet. There's been supervolcanoes, there's been earthquakes. Maybe something did happen after all, and there were some survivors, and they found a place to live, and that place was Egypt. And what we may have here is one of the best preserved examples of what really should be our heritage. This is where we came from. This is where civilization started. And to explore it and to see the roots is a fascinating, wonderful experience.